Okay, good morning, class. Now, today, what we are actually going to do is we're going to start with discussing today on the classical school, where we will be discussing on the neutrality of money, the classical dichotomy, walrus law, and introduction to money in a general setting. Okay, so let's start with the neutrality of money and the quantity theory. Okay, so the neutrality of money is when we say it is basically when we are talking of it's a general expression of the for the quantity theory of money which proposed. It's that what would we learn in quantity theory of money? We say we know that any change in the quantity of money results in an equal proportionate change in the absolute price level. But the relative factors, that is relative prices, relative rate of interest, real income, real wealth, and real output does not get affected. These are unaffected. So neutrality of money is actually a summary of the quantity theory of money. So if we go by the quantity theory of money, if the central bank permanently doubles the stock of money, then what happens? All nominal variables will double. That's what quantity theory of money says. So, and what do we see? We've just said that it's all the nominal variables will be affected, but the real variables remain same. So that's what is neutrality of money. So, in other words, the quantity theory of money and neutrality of money, they go hand in hand, they go together. Now, in the classical framework, let's, for example, what are the real outcomes, real economic outcomes that we have? That is real GNP, that is the output of goods and services produced, level of employment, that is when we level of employment, that is the number of labor hours or the number of workers employed, real wage rate, that is wage rate in terms of the purchasing power. These are all independent of the nominal values, that is the nominal quantity of money and the nominal prices. So what do we find is that in the quantity theory of money says that the quantity of money that determines the price level, but the real values, that is the real price, they are determined by the relative price ratios. All important features of the economic process can be understood if there were a barter system of real goods and services. Money does not have any specific role here. They do not. In the traditional terminology, what we say when money does not have a role, so we say that it is a veil. It acts as a veil over the real sector. It does not have any effect on the real sector. So it's just a covering. It's a partition to the real sector. So it does not have any effect. Okay, but the monetarism, they added a significant dimension to this, while otherwise they are also maintaining the faith with the classical theory of quantity theory, but they added some addition to this concept, where they said that changes in the quantity of money, it can have an impact on the real variables, but only from the short term perspective. It's temporary or short term. Whereas the long term aspect or the lasting impact of monetary change falls only on the nominal values. From the short term perspective, there will be an impact on the real variables, but from the long term perspective, it affects only the nominal variables. So they, according to the monetarists, their new version of neutrality of money is called monetarist super neutrality. That is, which says that the real outcomes are independent of the rate of change as well as the level of nominal prices. So what did the monetarists do? They had combined the long run neutrality and the short run non-neutrality to actually give an explanation to what is actually happening, explanation of the real life situations where you have some monetary disturbances happening and which plays a significant role. So they just said that in the short term it does affect, but in the long term it just gets neutralized and it does not affect the real variables. So, and they also provide a consistent interpretation of both inflation and deflation. So, inflation or deflation happens in the short term perspective, and then gradually it gets neutralized and equilibrium is achieved. So, that's what they had to say. So, in this aspect, the monetarists actually follow the footsteps of Irving Fisher and others in the quantity theory tradition, who said that neutrality is basically related with the long run situation, long run static situation, but not with the short run situation, which is actually where there's a transition phase, which the business cycle usually goes through because of the change in the quantity amount of money that we have. So that's why. So, when we talk of short-run neutrality of money, uh, it's basically related to the why does it happen, because of some of the rigidities. Price becomes sticky at that times, or sometimes so our expectations which we have is it's mistaken. We expect something and something else happens. We wrongly interpret, but in the long run, what happens, all these rigidities are no more there, it's eradicated, it's and all the errors in the expectations are also gets corrected, because over a span of time we get to know the mistakes, like what our expectations is, that is not correct. So we have enough time, and so accordingly what happens, which makes the real outcomes independent of the monetary changes. So in the long run, as the monetarist said, that money is neutral. Monetary policy can change the price level or the inflation rate in the long run, but it cannot change the potential output. It cannot do so. So as a result, what happens is central banks usually they set inflation targets for monetary policy. When they have the monetary policy, when they make changes, that keep in mind the inflation rates, not the output or the employment. Okay. Uh, Next topic that we have is the classical dichotomy. Now, according to the classical theory economists, classical theory, which proposed the classical theory of output and employment, said that any changes in the money affects only the nominal variables, that is money wages, nominal GNP, money balances. It does not have any effect on the real variables of the economy, that is the real GNP, when with the level of employment, real wage rate. So, according to the classical theory, the nominal variables move in proportion with the changes of the quantity of money. It moves in the same according to how in proportionate changes changes happens which is directly proportionate to the changes in the quantity of money. While the real variables, that is GNP, employment, real wage rate, real rate of interest, that remains unaffected. Okay, so what the classical economists had to say was that the real variables, all these real variables, they are determined by the real factors. Real factors are the stock of capital, the state of technology, the marginal physical product of labor, the household's preferences regarding work and leisure. So the real factors, real determined by some other things, whereas all the nominal factors, they get affected by the quantity of money. So as in the classical model, that which is based on flexibility of prices and wages, it says that the changes in money supply affects only the price level and the nominal variables, that is money wages, nominal interest rate, whereas the real variables, they remain unaffected. So, this independence of the real variables from changes in money supply and nominal variables is called classical dichotomy. Changes in the money supply does not affect the real variables. So there is a demarcation. So that is called classical dichotomy. So when we talk of classical dichotomy, it's derived from again from the quantity theory of money, where we have the formula mv equal to py. M we know is the stock of money, v is the velocity of some money circulation, p is the price level, and y is the level of income. So the py is the monetary value of output, which is equal to the aggregate monetary expenditure, that is mv. So when there is a change in the money supply M, it will actually affect the price level for a particular given activity. If an economy is at full employment level, what happens is, if there is, and in such a situation, if there's an increase in the money supply, it will only lead to a proportionate increase in the domestic price level. Why? Because it is there is a depreciation in the exchange rate of the currency. So that's why the price level increases. Okay, and this direction of casualty runs. How does it go? It goes. The effect is on price level from the money supply. The change has to come from M, which has an effect on P. It's not the other way around. It's not P increase in P leading to increase in M. So it's this. This is how the flow goes. And this is actually also connected to what we call the natural rate of interest theory. What is natural rate of interest? A natural rate of interest is actually it is determined in the long run through the equilibrium of savings and in investment. Okay, so this is basically a full employment position of a given economy. When there is an equilibrium in the long run, the savings equilibrium of savings and investment in the long run, the interest rate which helps in determining this equilibrium, that's the natural rate of interest. And this happens when there is a full equilibrium, full employment in the economy. And a market rate, any market rate that is either above or below this natural rate, will lead to a disequilibrium situation. Market rate is the actual rate. So any difference, if the market rate and the natural rate does not match, so there is a disequilibrium, and which will in the long run gets through adjustments with the help of market clearing, it again reaches equilibrium position in the long run, not in the short run. So any exogenous changes in the money supply, it actually shifts the rate of interest. And this is the process by which discrepancies between market rates and the natural rate of interest are generated. Change in money supply, market rate shifts. There is a difference between natural rate and market rate. There is disequilibrium because of discrepancy. So a market rate of interest which is below the natural rate of interest, it happens when there is more investment than savings. More investment. Okay. So what happens? Firms will demand more credit for investing. They would ask for more money, and which would result in an over investment. Excess of investment is there. And so what happens if the economy is at full employment position, which is full employment position is defined by the natural rate. So in such a case, what happens? It would lead to inflation. More money demanded, so prices go up. So because, as I said, prices of the goods starts rising, then what happens? People start consuming less. So automatically what happens? Savings will rise, and which would result in removing of this excess investment over savings, and ultimately equilibrium is attained. Just the opposite happens if the market rate of interest is above the natural rate of interest. What happens? Savings exceed investment, and so a process of deflation starts happening. Okay, next topic is Walras law. Now, Walras law, what does it say? It's a theory which says that surplus in one market must be adequately complemented by insufficiency in another market, so that there will be the markets will be in equilibrium. Surplus in one is compensated by there is a deficiency or insufficient in another market. And this law was developed by Leon Walras in 1874, right? Well, this law is aims at achieving an equivalent position in market. And for markets to be in equilibrium, what happens? What he had said was excess demand in one market. It actually means there is excess supply in the other market, and that's how the equilibrium happens. So through in exchange of goods and services, equilibrium comes up. So Walras law holds that a general equilibrium is created in the market if surplus in one market means shortage in another market. So then equilibrium is created. According to this law, so markets are forced to be in a state of equilibrium when there is excess supply in one market and excess demand in another market. And this can be achieved through the help of a supreme force and not just market force. So what is this? Not market force, but it has to be some supernatural power, supreme force. So what is the rationale behind this law? It's that excess demand, what happens? It results in an increase in the price of goods. Whereas when we have excess supply, that means it leads to an increase, is a decrease in the price of goods. And that's how a balance is achieved in the market. And it is believed that producers would aim to maximize profit in the market, whereas the consumers, they will seek for interest that's going to benefit them. That's the belief. Now, let's look into this in the mathematical part of the law. Let there be I goods. So I is 1 to I, okay? And let there be J individuals, where J is 1 to J. J stands for 1 to J, right? And the prices of the goods are given by P, where it's P1 to up to I, because there are I goods. Sij is the quantity of goods I that the jth customer is planning to sell at the price P. And Dij is the quantity of the ith good that jth customer is planning to buy at the price P. So, as per Waller's law, if each individual satisfies his or her budget constraint, so that the value of goods sold equals the value of goods bought, then what happens is the total value of all the sales by all individuals equals the total value of all purchases by all individuals. Total volume of sales, it will be equal to total volume of purchases, right? Now see, how do we go about with, how do we prove this? For every consumer J for any price P, right? So what happens? We say the total sales equal to total purchases. For first good, for good one, price is one, and for the jth customer. So that's how it go. P1 S1J. For the second good, it's P2 S2J. That's how it goes up to jth, up to ith product. And here the same thing happens with the demand side, right? This is a supply S, demand is denoted by P. So if we actually summarize this, what happens? It's a summation of PI, if I stands from 1 to I, and Sijp. And here, if you summarize the demand part, summation of PI, Dij, PI, a sum for summing. Now what happens? Now when if you start summing for all J customers, and what happen, and you start rearranging that summation, we put summation of J from 1 to J, and just we need to just put a summation for all customers, J customers, okay? So same thing comes up here also. Both the sides you add that, the summation for the jth customer, summation of all the goods total sales, and summation of all the purchases for all the J customers. Now, if you can take the PR, the price out, because it's you just take it out, and so it's just a rearrangement. So P summation of PI, summation of Sij is equal to summation of PI, summation of Dij. So if you actually see this actually tells us, like if you simplify this, the last equation, that exactly results in what we have is summation of PI SIP equal to summation of PI DIP. So here what we have, SIP is the total quantity of goods supplied at price I, whereas DIP is the total quantity of goods demanded. of at price pi. So this means what? What does this means? That at any price, the total value of planned sales will always be equal to the total value of the planned purchases. There's a reverse that corollary, as we say, to this law, that if all the markets, with the exception of the market K, are in equilibrium, that is SIP is equal to DIP, that is equal to QI, that's a quantity, right? Q for all I which is not equal to K, and price of K is also not equal to 0, then we assume that even for the kth market, this will hold true. So in other words, if all but one markets are cleared, then the remaining market must also be cleared. Okay, so how do we prove this? The total value of planned sales, we know that is equal to the total value of planned purchases. So this is the equation that we had. PI is equal to PI. Now let's break it up. This, when we talk of I, we said except for the kth, we put the kth market separately, kth commodity. So I equal to, it's not equal to K. So it's less than K minus 1. And the kth market, the total value of sales, we put it separately. Same thing here. We break it up, this into PIDI for I not equal to K up to K minus 1 plus PKDK for the kth market. So what do we know? We had seen in the previous equation that SIP is equal to DIP is equal to QI, right? SIP equal to DIP equal to QI for I not equal to K, right? So what happens is instead of SI, we put QI, and instead of DI, we put QI. So it's PIQI, PKSK is equal to PI summation of PIQI plus PKDK. So this gets cancelled. So what are we left with? PKSK is equal to PKDK. So what is it? And PK and PK, these are again common. So it gets cancelled. So what we have is SKP is equal to DKP, right? So which actually tells that the kth market is also in equilibrium. Now what does Walras's law tells us? It tells us that if income equals spending for every individual, then the sum over of all individuals' income will be equal to sum over of all individual spending. If for every individual, if income equal to spending, then if you sum total for every sum total of everyone's income is equal to sum total of everyone's spendings. But this, this is a very general result. It applies to virtually any economy. It does with any number of goods, any number of customers. And the corollary says that if all but one market are in equilibrium, the remaining market will also be in equilibrium. So what does that mean? If one market is not in equilibrium, then some of the markets must be in disequilibrium. That will happen. If equilibrium happens, it will be for all. If there is disequilibrium even in one market, that means some of the other markets are also in disequilibrium. So, according to Keynes, what he had said that the key assumption that Keynes has made that all the markets except the labor market are cleared. Well, because the labor market itself is not in equilibrium, because of the demand and supply of labor. There is variation. Labor market cannot be in equilibrium. But Walras said that no, it will be possible. So Walras showed that it is a mathematical impossibility. If all the markets are in equilibrium, then the labor market will also be in equilibrium. So what are the limitations of Walras law? First thing is, one of the major limitations that comes up is it is difficult to portray the law mathematically. Why? Because there are no such mathematical equations which says how equilibrium can be achieved in all markets. when there is excess supply in one market and excess demand in another market? It's very difficult to say because we say there has to be some supernatural power. And also, the second thing is the utility function of Walras law is not considered realistic. And because the utility function cannot be practiced, so the law does not hold good. These are the two criticisms that we have. Coming up to the last topic that we have, that is introduction to money in a general equilibrium. As per the general equilibrium theory, it explains how supply and demand in an economy with many markets, if they interact, dynamic interaction happens and ultimately results in equilibrium of prices. So the theory assumes as an assumption that there is a gap between actual prices and the equilibrium prices. There is. And that's why the goal of the theory is to identify the precise set of circumstances under which equilibrium price is likely to achieve stability. The gap is there between equilibrium price and actual price. And so, what could be the circumstances under which equilibrium prices can be achieved? Now, general equilibrium exists when all prices are in equilibrium. Every customer spends his income in a manner that gives him the maximum satisfaction. All firms in each industry are in equilibrium at all prices and output. Supply and demand for productive resources. Productive resources are the factors of production, are all equal at equilibrium prices. So then only can general equilibrium happen, when everything is in equilibrium situation. Okay, and the theory is very, again, closely related with that of Leon Walras, who wrote the Elements of Pure Economics in 1874. So what Walras had, how he explained the general equilibrium theory is where he described the simplest economy which is imaginable, where there are only two goods that could be exchanged. Let these two goods be as X, denote as X and Y, and everyone in the economy is assumed to be a buyer of one of these products and a seller of the other. So you're buying one, selling the other. And under this model, what he said was that supply and demand would be interdependent. They are related to each other because the consumption of these goods, each of these goods, depends on the wages that is achieved from selling each of the goods. That depends. That's what they had to say. Whatever goods you want to purchase, it depends. It's at a price. It depends on what the producers want to sell, how much they want to sell at that price. So what the sellers are earning, that's wages for them. The price of each of the goods would be decided how? By a bidding process. Bidding process, which also known as statonement, which Walras referred to it as statonement. And what Walras believed that there would be no exchange of goods in the equilibrium until the equilibrium price is achieved, which is an assumption which is actually criticized by the others. Okay, so why? Because only it may not be the same. Like until and unless equilibrium price is achieved, it will not happen. Goods among transactions cannot take place, like buying and selling of goods. That is not very realistic. We'll see why. We just go tell this a little later. So the general equilibrium analysis that we have, it's based on certain assumptions. It says there is perfect competition both in the commodity and the factors market. Taste and habits of consumers are given and they're constant. Income of consumers are also constant. They're given and constant. Factors of production, they are perfectly mobile between the different occupations, different places. You can shift. There are constant returns to scale. All the firms operate under identical cost conditions. All units of a productive services, they are homogeneous. There are no changes in the techniques of production, and there is full employment of labor and other resources. Now, given these assumptions, what happens is the economy is in a state of general equilibrium when the demand for every commodity and service equals to the supply for all of these commodities and services. It also implies that there exists a perfect harmony of all the decisions that is made by all the market participants. The decisions, even the decisions of the consumers with regards to purchase of each of these commodities must be in accord with the decisions of producers for producing and selling of these commodities. So the decision of producers and the consumers has to be the same. What the consumers want to buy, that's what it's produced. So, and also the decisions of the owners for selling each factor or service must be in total harmony with that of their employers. They're doing it what their employers are telling. It's only when the decision of the buyers of goods and services fits with the decision of the sellers, that is, then only the market is considered to be in general equilibrium, which does not happen always. It cannot happen. How can the decision of buyers and sellers will always be in same similar? So there are certain limitations. First is like the first limitation is the theory actually it's based on a number of unrealistic assumptions, which are very much contradictory to what is actually happening in the world. First is where we talk of perfect competition. It is there's nothing called perfect competition in reality. Second limitation that we have is where general equilibrium is a static situation where it is said that every customers and producers in they consume the same products, they produce the same products day in day out without any time lag. There's no time lag. Okay, it's static. It's going on. The process is going on, but there is a time gap, right? It's not a continuous thing. So some of the consumers will not purchase the same things every day, every moment. There will be a gap. Even with the production, there will be some gap. And the taste, preferences, and aims are, it says, are all same. Economic decisions are in perfect harmony with each other. So this cannot happen. Okay, the central feature of the general equilibrium is the Walrasian marketplace, where Walrus he imagined a formal market structure which is operating by certain rules, which would ensure that trade could take place in commodities even if there were no money to facilitate trade. And how can that happen? How can trade between buyers and sellers take place without any involvement of money? And but it is done in a very organized way. So these are some of the conditions how it happens. Trade takes place on particular days, that is market days, and accounts are settled at the end of the day between traders. Second condition, traders enter the market with a bundle of goods that they want to sell, which they have either received as an endowment or produced in the period since their previous day. Either they got or they have produced it. There has to be an auctioneer who is the coordinator of the marketplace who would seek the relative prices of one goods in terms of the other, at which the traders are willing to exchange their goods, which is this process, as we said earlier, is called tatonement. And only when satisfactory prices are found, the exchange takes place between the suppliers and buyers. That's what Walrasian market condition says. And by this process, what happens? Equilibrium could be attained without requiring money, with the active involvement of the auctioneer who would help in bringing the suppliers and buyers together, agree on some relative prices to clear the markets. This is, this is also said by, along with Walrus, even Jean Baptiste Say also had the same thing to say. This is a pure exchange economics, right? Where it said that the system could work without money, but the exchanges are conduct more effectively with money than without. You can do it without money, but if money is there, it becomes easier. So they have taken up, there are two cases. First is where we talk of barter economy, where prices of you do not have money involved, and here what happens: the prices of goods in a barter economy, they are actually specified in terms of, they cannot be specified in terms of monetary terms because money does not exist, but they can be actually expressed in relative terms. In relative terms, in using one of the two ways. One, the relative price of the goods can be given in terms of one specific good, that is gold. In terms of gold, the relative prices are determined. Or there is another way where the average price of goods is determined and then price of each good is given in comparison to the average. So there's an important aspect out here is that auctioneer's existence we know is very critical, right, for this operation because without the auctioneer's service, there's no one to coordinate the market and ensure that the participants they go by the rules. But since money is not involved here, so there is no incentive for the market, for the auctioneers. There's no incentive for anyone to take on this role because they do not get any reward. There's no money, and they don't want to participate in trade. So how would trade happen in such a situation? How would it happen when there's no incentive like in a barter system? Where is the auctioneer? So it is, this is very important. The auctioneers have to be assumed in existence. So it is assumed that the auctioneers are there. It's there, but it's not there. They are assuming there is someone who is actually helping, who is intervening, ensuring that the equilibrium price is determined. Actually there's no one there. It's just assumed. And the second thing is the process by which auctioneers determines equilibrium in individual goods market is how by calculating the excess demand for each good over the available supply. Excess demand, what does it mean? For the auctioneer, it means that the relative price of goods must rise in order to clear the market and for establishing equilibrium, whereas for excess supply, price has to fall to achieve equilibrium. Also, the auctioneer has the task of coordination and they must set the equilibrium relative prices that will achieve equilibrium in all the markets simultaneously. So, a question that comes up is it in reality possible? Walrus proved that it is possible to find a set of relative prices that equilibrates all markets simultaneously, which we just learned a little earlier in Walrus law. So, what happens in a barter economy? Individuals will demand commodities as long they still have the commodity ready to be supplied. As long as the supply is there, the commodities will be demanded by individuals. So, what does that mean? It means that any excess supply of commodities means there is a demand for the commodities. So, demand cannot exceed the supplies. The aggregate demand will not exceed the aggregate supplies. Demand will be there equal to how much demand to exactly how much is the supply, what is the total supply. And if there is an excess supply means what? That there is a demand for it. That's why that excess supply is there and which people are going to purchase it. And that's how equilibrium will be attained. The second case that we come up is where we introduce, where we talk of monetary economy, where money comes into play. So if we replace barter economy with the monetary one, what happens? It actually implies that there is a good which is readily accepted as a unit of account, means of exchange, store of value. So what happens? You do not have to buy when you serve. If you don't want to buy some goods like you. It's not that you're buying whatever you want. If you want to sell something, it's not that you have to buy something in return. You can get money. You can get money which can be kept, which has purchasing power, which can be used later. So in the first place, what happens? The relative prices are specified in monetary units and not in terms of other goods. Secondly, you can exchange goods for money. And the third thing is money is storable, then what happens? But because it's storable, purchasing power can be held from one market date to another next. It's not that you have to sell off everything. You have money, you're selling your goods, you get money, you can keep it, If you don't want to use it today, you can use it tomorrow or day after. So in monetary economies, what happens is there is a need to transform commodities into money, or the system to reproduce itself, for the system to actually reproduce itself. Commodities, you need to transform it. Without a monetary transformation of commodities into money, the system breaks down. Economic crises are thus some of the observable facts that cannot be dealt with in a moneyless system. How will economic crisis happens? Like when if you don't have money, you cannot work without it. It's in an when economic crisis happens, you need money. There has to be adjustments in the monetary system. Monetary policy has to take adjustments takes place. So if in a moneyless economy, it's difficult. So in such an economy, if such an economy takes place, what happens? It is only when the monetary side of the economy is in equilibrium that the real side of the economy is in equilibrium. Only when the when you have money, then what happens? Only when the monetary side of the economy is in equilibrium will the real side also be in equilibrium. It can happen. How can this happen? It can happen if demand and supply of money are equal. If demand and supply of money are equal, then when the monetary side of the economy is in equilibrium, real side of the money's economy is also in equilibrium. But there is a possibility also that the real side of the economy may not be necessarily equilibriate, may not. Why? Because some suppliers may find that there is the demand that is there that is not sufficient to release their stocks available for sale. They can keep it till the prices go on. And there may be others who may find that there is more demand for a good than supply available to meet it if the demand for money and the supply of money are not equalized. If it's the demand and supply is not an equilibrium, then what happens? The demand for goods, there'll be more demand for goods. So then let that disequilibrium be there in the money market, which would result in excess demand for goods. Prices starts increasing, and then they want to supply it. Okay. Okay. So that's all that we have in this. We'll see you in next class.